out. A left to the jaw, and...
Oh, my block is knocked off.
Some of the ideology behind why one place gets attention and not another. Obviously, U.S. funding is a big part of why so many people pay attention to Israel.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see...
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Cyber Dandy here is going to introduce the discussion as I forced that upon him before you arrived. So,
Yep. Surprise, surprise. So, welcome everybody. Ben Burgis from Give Them an Argument and many other things. Douglas Lane from Sublation Media and also other things. And myself, Cyber Dandy from Cyber Dandy. Recently, Ben hosted a class on Proudhon versus Marx, and we read the first half of Proudhon's System of Economic Contradictions, which is the only half available in English, and then followed it up with a reading of Marx's Poverty of Philosophy, which is a critique of that book, more or less. So I think, how many months were we in that class, Ben? Like 4 or 5?
Yeah, maybe like 4. It was like they're both short books, but we went over it relatively slowly.
Yeah, so we wanted to follow up on that and do an episode together because Doug had worked with me on the idea of eventually doing something on Proudhon, and you had this class coming up, so we thought it'd be great if all of us got together and chatted it out.
Nice.
you guys have me at a disadvantage. I have read the Poverty of Philosophy and skimmed the Proudhon, but I did not spend months studying it. So I expect to be corrected as we go through the conversation.
Well, if you had, one thing that you know is that the corrected is going to be hard because Proudhon's writing style means that it's often a little tricky to nail down exactly. I mean, it depends. Some parts of it are clearer than others, but it's often fairly tricky to nail down what he means. I mean, it's like, so I think part of the reason that so many more people have read the Poverty of Philosophy is just that it's like so much better written, that like, that it's that he's kind of at an advantage there that has nothing to do with the ideas that they're arguing about.
Well, I took a glance at both texts, and I thought that obviously biased in favor of Marx. I thought the major difference was that Proudhon spoke in abstract generalities in general, and whereas Marx wasn't writing Capital or something like that when he was responding to Proudhon, so he was often sniping at Proudhon. But I generally found myself, predisposed to siding with Marx, and then easily confirmed in my initial assumptions. But what I have written down here, and both of you can tell me how far from the mark I am or if I'm close. The primary criticism of Proudhon is that he assumes what he sets out to explain. He needs to, what needs to be added is a description of how exchange. So this is in the section on opposition value, the opposition of value in use and value in exchange. That's,
okay.
And it's worth noting that Marx doesn't begin his critique of Proudhon with chapter 1, but with chapter 2 of the Proudhon, because the first chapter is kind of twaddle. So the primary criticism is that Proudhon assumes what he sets out to explain. That is, he needs to add a description of how exchange value came to dominate society Instead, Proudhon takes exchange value as a natural consequence of mankind's desires and suggests that exchange value arose through some sort of agreement amongst men.
Right.
Proudhon supposes that no bourgeois economists have noticed the opposition between exchange value and use value. Marx corrects him on this and demonstrates that the opposition is well known amongst bourgeois economists. It's a well-known fact. But that would be the overall critique of Proudhon, if you put it in a more generalized way, would be that Proudhon takes the current conditions of society, of bourgeois society, as natural and doesn't arrive at how they developed historically, nor does he provide a systematic understanding of the categories of bourgeois society, but instead speaks of things in kind of abstract, general ways, and creating his own dichotomies along the way would sometimes or often enough obscure more than they reveal. That would
that's definitely not bad for not reading it super close. That criticism is in there for sure. I don't really accept the criticism entirely, because the way that Proudhon pitches his book is as a direct response to the political economists and utopian socialists at the time. So he's beginning from their importance that they place on value and exchange value, and not like Marx developing this history of how we got to where we are.
So I guess I'm not sure about this part, because this is like, whether you're right about that or not isn't really directly answered within the text. That there isn't, I mean, I think that it's possible that that's right. But he certainly doesn't say as much. And I don't know. I mean, like,
you're talking to Cyber Dandy now that Proudhon doesn't say that he's directing this.
Yeah,
as a critique of economists.
I mean, he certainly does criticize both of those groups of people in the book. That's true, right? Like he does, he is critical of both bourgeois economists and utopian socialists in the book. But I this sort of assumption that it's like, well, that's, therefore this sort of explains how he's presenting things, that, he's sort of accepting their assumptions or something like that.
No.
Oh, okay.
He definitely says it right from the outset that the political economists take value to be the cornerstone of their theory, and this is how I'm going to respond to them. And I have a bunch of quotes about this, but it's
sure. I'd actually be. I mean, I don't know how much time I want to spend on this, but I'd actually be pretty interested in seeing the quotes. But yeah. I mean, I guess like Marx's defense of the honor of the bourgeois economist maybe strikes me as the least interesting part of the poverty of philosophy. I think that but I think elements of the rest of what Doug says do line up with with I think what are more interesting things that might be going on there, and and I think that the sort of most interesting to me difference between Marx and Proudhon is roughly along the lines of one of the things Doug just said, right, which is about the approach towards economic history, and hence in Marx's mind the history of all the stuff that's superstructural from economics. So that Proudhon talks a lot about like humanity as a whole, the social genius. He uses this name Prometheus for the sort of collective genius of humanity, figuring things out over time. And it does seem to me that, that he basically does have this view that, it's not it's not static in the sense that there's no historical progress. Of course, Proudhon definitely thinks there is historical progress, but the sort of ground on which that progress is happening in a certain way, I think, is kind of static for Proudhon. That he does, in fact, when he's talking about things like exchange, he does, in fact, talk about that as this sort of a priori, like, conceptual problem that Prometheus has to solve. How do we go about getting the benefits of lots of different kinds of activities that people do without doing them all yourself. And yeah, and that's and there is a lot of that kind of thing there, right? That he sort of Proudhon, I think, sees history in terms of like humanity sort of collectively figuring out how to solve these problems that it has in the broadest sense, right? So whereas what Marx sees are these different modes of production that kind of have their own laws, their own needs, and that the what's going on within them and how the transitions between them happen is all about class struggle, and it is. And so, like, for example, I don't want to run away with this too much if you were going somewhere else, but do you want me to keep going with this?
No, I mean, so far I basically agree. I might put it in different terms,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
And I have an addition to make,
Sure.
which is that it's not only does he see, you're quite right, I think, Ben, that he sees that there are different modes of production and therefore different kind of grounds for the social problems that we face. In other words, we face different problems
Mhm.
based on the different ways in which we've organized our material reproduction, say. But beyond that, he gives a specific example to kind of overturn Proudhon's approach, which is that, in fact, the
Uh-huh.
exchange didn't dominate society in the way that it does now. In the past, it was not a universal problem that was just based on man's Promethean nature, but something changed, and it used to be in the past that people were mostly producing what they needed for themselves. They were subsistence farmers, and while there might have been lords who took a tax from all the different peasant farmers, nonetheless, the range of production was much narrower, and the kinds of things that people needed, and therefore the need for exchange, was much narrower. So one of the ways we can look at the change in production is also a way of kind of expanding the Promethean nature of the human person. That in a bourgeois society, we become more obviously Promethean. We become more obviously expansive because the demands of the economy are such that there will be more needs for innovation and more needs for an expansion of production and creation of new needs.
yeah,
So that what's transformed is the kind of character of humanity. What it may be, the what's developed is a realm of freedom under bourgeois conditions. Certainly, the character of freedom has changed as the mode of production has changed. It's a social relationship around that's necessary for that mode of production to be instantiated has changed. So that's all
so
I'd add.
yeah, I think where the biggest difference is that Proudhon tends to tie things to exchange itself, and Marx ties things to modes of production. Uh, I think part of the confusion as far as the trans-historical way that exchange is depicted in Proudhon's work is that what he wants to say is that there's no such thing as value until you have exchange. And so until people start exchanging things with each other, those things aren't thought of as value. as exchange value. They're just useful things, right? So he doesn't give an account of this emergence of exchange society because what he's focused on is value and
Right.
what is value.
But he does also say, though, right? It's not just that he's not focused on it. I mean, like, he does very explicitly say that people start exchanging because they have this like a priori problem, you know, of like how they're going to, you know, they're going to meet these various needs, and then, you know, and then sure, he does say the exchange hasn't always existed. He does, you know, that's true, right? But like he also says, like, as he's describing it coming into existence, like he says, like, you know, he describes it, like the word he actually uses is like this logical problem of like how we're going to like meet our needs or whatever. And then he says, like, he has some formulation, like the historical process follows the logical order. So, you know, so he does, you know, he really does portray these sort of needs that exchange satisfies as being sort of timeless and intrinsic to the human condition.
The needs, I think, yes. But then he goes on to say that new values are increasingly created as human beings start exchanging with each other, and sort of what Doug just said, that you do get into more complex societies where you are generating new values all the time.
Sure.
I think the way I'd put it, there's dynamism in Proudhon's system, but it's more like a screensaver than like a movie. So,
yeah.
You know, like you'll have something bouncing around on your screen for a screensaver, but you don't really have this kind of development over time that you get in Marx.
Yeah, I like the metaphor. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, you know, it just does seem to me that the way that Proudhon describes it, you definitely get this picture that it's you have this sort of timeless problem that maybe very slowly gets solved, right? But that's a very different view from saying that, you know, essentially you have new problems that arise from, you know, from new stages of history that, you know, that like come, that, you know, if, again, so what I was starting to say earlier, right, is that I think, you know, probably one of the places in, I mean, when I read this in the, you know, System of Economic Contradictions, or, you know, the one translation of the subtitle, and sometimes it's used as the title. That's what Marx's title is playing off of, you know, The Philosophy of Poverty. The one passage in there, and when I read it, did not have the poverty philosophy, you know, freshly in mind, but it still really hit me as like, oh, wow, this is like where the difference between Proudhon and Marx gets super obvious. And then Marx indeed goes after this passage in The Poverty of Philosophy, is when Proudhon's talking about the French Revolution, and he says that you know, it would be ridiculous to try to reverse this historical progress of the French Revolution, you know, that proclaimed free trade along with all the other freedoms that they were fighting for. And, you know, he doesn't use this language. This is my gloss on what he's saying, right? But like he seems to, you know, his view seems to be, well, this is like one of like Prometheus's like settled verdicts, you know, that like, you know, humanity figured out that it needed, you know, free trade. And so now we just have to build on that, right, as we go into this sort of, you know, mutualist alternative to both, you know, capitalism and the views of the European socialists that he's going to put forward. And Marx's response to that in The Poverty of Philosophy is exactly what you'd expect it to be, given Marx's views, which is that he says, wait a second, this is absurd. You're saying that, you know, because bourgeois revolutionaries in the 18th century proclaim free trade to meet their historical needs at the time, that means that other people in the 19th century don't have other historical needs, you know, in the name of which they might overthrow it, right? Like that and I think you really get that difference between that, you know, sort of timeless problem that's slowly being solved and the new problems that arise at new times in history views.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I want to go back to defend the fact that Marx critiqued Proudhon for misunderstanding the bourgeois economist.
Okay. Yeah, you guys fight about that.
Because the reason it is important to note that the bourgeois economists had reached similar conclusions to Proudhon that Proudhon claims to have reached on his own, but also to realize that their development of the ideas were more systematic and more thoroughgoing and less idealized than and less abstract than Proudhon's. And the reason all that's important to realize is because also those guys, like especially Adam Smith, were advocating for a new form of society when they wrote. They were revolutionaries of a kind then, and so it's comparing the bourgeois revolutionaries to the socialist revolutionaries. And one of the things that Marx was doing was critiquing reactionary elements, regressive elements within the socialist movement, the romantic strains within the socialist movements. And so it's worth noting that Proudhon is falling below the level of Adam Smith as he writes. He's not as advanced as a bourgeois economist. I know I sound like a certain platypus person, but it is there.
Yeah, it was such a more palatable version. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. And I'll let Cyber Dandy respond, but I just wanted to put a pin in the fact that like something that would be really good to touch on here is because Proudhon definitely does have a critique of the utopian socialists, but what the difference is between that critique and Marx's critique. But yeah, Cyber Dandy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think one thing I just want to point out before we go much further is that the poverty of philosophy has way more that it misses than what it hits. We're definitely hitting on the good parts, but the first 2 chapters at least are really full of misrepresentations and kind of just jousting and not really deep arguments. And it's really the second part of the book that you get some of these better arguments about methodology and stuff like that.
Can you give me an example of a clear miss or a misrepresentation from the first chapter? Because I kind of took my examples, I think, like I have an example about the use value and exchange value opposition. I think that's from the first chapter. But what do you see as a miss?
So one thing that Marx gets on Proudhon for in the first bit of this is he says that Proudhon confuses the seller with the buyer or something along those lines, where he inverts, like, let me put this another way. Proudhon makes it very clear that use value, the buyer, and are one side of the exchange, whereas exchange value is determined by an estimate of what the buyer is going to pay for it. There's a point that Marx keeps hitting on throughout the first chapter where he keeps saying that, no, Proudhon inverted this, or Proudhon forgot about demand, right? And this whole ongoing thing about Proudhon not understanding how demand works. And I've gone through sentence by sentence and compared the texts and found, every way that this is incorrect and not really what Proudhon said at all.
Well, I found that section in the poverty of philosophy. Shall we go over it and see what's wrong with it here? So he says, these are what we should call, these are what we should almost call truisms, yet we have to repeat them here in order to render Mr. Proudhon's mysteries comprehensible. So that this is Proudhon now, so that following up the principle to its ultimate consequences, one would come to the conclusion, the most logical in the world, that the things whose use is indispensable and whose quantity is unlimited should be had for nothing, and those whose utility is nil and whose scarcity is extreme should be of incalculable worth. To cap the difficulty, these extremes are impossible in practice. On the one hand, no human product could ever be unlimited in magnitude. on the other, even the scarcest thing would perforce be useful to a certain degree. Otherwise, it would be quite valueless. Use value and exchange value are thus inexorably bound up with each other, although by their nature, they continually tend to be mutually exclusive. And then Marx says, what caps Proudhon's difficulty? That he has simply forgotten about demand, and that a thing can be scarce or abundant only insofar as it is in demand. The moment he leaves out demand, he identifies exchange value with scarcity and use value with abundance. In reality, in saying that things whose utility is nil and scarcity extreme are of incalculable worth, he is simply declaring that exchange value is merely scarcity. Scarcity extreme and utility nil means pure scarcity. Incalculable worth is the maximum of exchange value. It is pure exchange value. He equates these two terms. Therefore, exchange value and scarcity are equivalent terms. In arriving at these alleged extreme consequences, Proudhon has in fact carried to the extreme not the things, but the terms which express them, and in so doing, he shows proficiency in rhetoric in all their nakedness. Rather than logic, he merely rediscovers his first hypothesis in all their nakedness when he thinks he's discovered new consequences. Now I'll stop there.
Right. And that's actually one of the main portions I'm referring to.
Right.
So, like, Proudhon equates demand and use value and the buyer. These are, that's the way he thinks about it, right? So there's no point at which he forgets about demand. He just doesn't explicitly say demand. He's saying that we could only value things if they are useful and that are somewhere between totally scarce and totally abundant. So value can only really happen between those two extremes. That's what he's getting at in this thing that Marx is responding to.
So what is Marx claiming here? That he's saying that he leaves out demand in terms of determining whether something is scarce or not, right?
Yeah. So right. So I think
demand is being equated with use value, which is on the side of production. Is that how it's split within Proudhon?
I think the point Marx is trying to make is that because Proudhon doesn't factor in demand in the market, that he thinks that markets operate just by abundance and scarcity.
Oh, okay. I'm
not sure it's true that it's in the market.
Marx is saying that actually, right? Like that Proudhon is saying that, right? I think I was largely planning to stay out of this part because I wasn't sure I had a strong view about whether Marx was getting Proudhon right in this part, but it seems like what Marx is saying, as I recall that passage, is that Proudhon is treating this something as a big mystery that's only a big mystery if you describe it or set up the problem in a way that doesn't account for demand, right? I mean, that was my impression of what the accusation was. I think that's a different accusation than like Proudhon in general, like doesn't know that demand exists or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's be clear. What is Proudhon saying in this paragraph? He's saying, so he's saying the following up the principle to its ultimate consequences, one would come to conclusion that the things whose use is indispensable and whose quantity is unlimited should be had for nothing. So in other words, we're talking about what sets a price here. And if the quantity of something is unlimited and it's very useful, then demand would not determine that it would have a high price because there's an unlimited supply, and so therefore it would be had for nothing. And then on the other hand, if you have something that is not useful but is that's very scarce, then it would be whose utility is nil and whose scarcity is extreme. It should be of an infinite price, which is an absurd conclusion. To cap the difficulty, these extremes are impossible in practice. So he's saying, we don't encounter this. This isn't what happens, but according to the logic of economics, it should. I think. No human product could ever be unlimited in magnitude, and even the scarcest thing must have some use value, or else it wouldn't have any value. So use value and exchange value are thus inexorably bound up with each other, although by their nature they continually tend to be mutually exclusive. So, all right. So, what is he saying here that is that Marx is objecting to? Is he just saying not very much? Is that the objection? Do you think, Ben? That he's like explaining something that need not be explained?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of why I was going to set out as part of the discussion, because I'm not sure I have a confident view about what Proudhon is saying there. But I, you know, again, my memory of at least the structure of Marx's objection is that, Proudhon is setting up these antinomies that, that he sees as these sort of like, kind of profound, mysterious things that Marx is saying, no, it's not actually that, mysterious, or you're making it mysterious by describing it in this kind of obtuse way that leaves out, this like really big factor.
So
Right.
if you look at the bigger context of the quote that Marx gives in the book, this is a section where Proudhon is basically laying out why scarcity and abundance matter. He does this before moving on to other impacts on value and on exchange value. So it's like Marx is taking a preliminary idea that Proudhon is talking about and expecting to get a more advanced idea out of it, which he does a few times. And then he'll later quote some other piece of Proudhon, and all of a sudden, demand is there, or Proudhon is saying the thing that Marx said he didn't say, or vice versa. This is the kind of stuff that it doesn't hit very well if you're really going to examine both texts next to each other.
Well, I mean, we're kind of doing that right now, right? Because I have both texts open on my computer. It's amazing, the technology.
Right. So if you look at the full quote.
Is this quote Proudhon's in the first chapter or the second? I mean, in the second chapter.
It should be the second. Almost everything Marx quotes is going to be from pretty much the same area, except a few bits from volume 2, which kind of makes me doubt if Marx read the whole book. But
okay, yeah. I bet he did, because he's Marx. And we love Marx. Okay, so what?
Also, like, I think that Marx can be fairly accused of a lot of different kinds of bad behavior and like faction fights, but I don't really think one of them is not doing every possible bit of reading he could get his hands on in every circumstance. Like, this is a guy who, spent like thousands of hours like reading like the reports of English factory inspectors. Who's writing Capital. He has like he teaches himself Russian in part to, to try to get, like answer a question somebody asked, so in other words, like, I think like when you're saying Marx isn't showing sufficient interpretive charity, that doesn't stretch the bounds of the imagination for me. It's like, yeah, okay. I think that's something Marx might have done, right? That he might have like gotten pissed off about it and like interpreted something in a bad light. Or if you say like, he was like in many ways guy was kind of a bare knuckle brawler as far as this stuff goes, but like, come on, he did the reading.
I mean, no, I seriously have questions about that, because I don't understand why he's quoting things on a topic from chapters that aren't dedicated to that topic. I don't understand why all the quotes are coming from only these first couple chapters, or even the first sections of the chapters. And it's not that I think Marx doesn't have the capacity or doesn't have the the will to want to do that. To me, it feels like he thinks Proudhon is so dumb that all he has to do is find like the epitome of Proudhon in these few sections and critique that, and that'll produce a sufficient work on its own.
Yeah, I don't know. I think whatever was available to him at the time, I just
Well, we
have
can't
a
know
hard
for
time
sure. There were no
imagining
security cameras.
as you say, there's no way to know.
But well, I guess one way we could know is whether or not what he's critiquing, the critiques actually land, right? And so the question for me is, what is the claim that Proudhon is making here that Marx is critiquing? Why is it important to for Proudhon to point out that there's a mystery, because he does, about the fact that scarcity, let's see, what does he say? That scarcity is on the side of use values, and you can find abundance on the side of exchange, or something like that, that these things are connected, and not
So,
completely separated out.
Right. So what Proudhon is doing here is he's saying, why, when people produce more, are they worth less in exchange? And it's because they're creating an abundance. Whereas if you want something to be worth more in exchange, there needs to be a scarcity for it. And he's laying out how abundant and how scarce they need to be. It can't be totally abundant, and it can't be totally scarce. It needs to be somewhere between those two so that there is a value to exchanging them.
So Proudhon is saying that the source of value, and therefore in some way or another of price, is either the scarcity or the abundance of the commodities?
Only in this section, because he goes on to discuss the way that estimated value on the part of the seller is a way that the seller is trying to figure out what the use value is of the buyer for whatever the product is. And this is something else Marx confuses. When he talks about it, he doesn't realize that Proudhon is talking about, I want to sell you a chicken. I have to figure out how much you're going to pay for it, is what Proudhon means by estimated value. Marx seems to take that to mean something else.
What does Marx take it to mean?
I'd have to look at my notes, but I know I commented on it.
Just kind of my knee-jerk reaction to this is to say that while abundance and scarcity are operating factors in determining price, but the way they do that is mediated through production. So if something is abundant, that would probably mean that it didn't take a lot of labor to produce, just to be real simple-minded about it. And so that its price, which would be connected to the labor time, although not identical to it, would be lower because it could be produced more easily and quickly, and therefore it would be more abundant. Then, if the price were to then go up, it would probably be because the number of workers dedicated to producing that particular item would decline as profitability in that sector declined. Therefore, if the demand held steady, the supply would decline. But it is not simply the demand or the scarcity that is determining the value.
Right.
Rather, it is the amount of time dedicated to producing the commodity. And so, does Proudhon, at this point, we're like reaching the level of Adam Smith, right? Oh, like Burgess. Oh, I think
he'll be right back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Proudhon definitely gets into all of that later. Throughout the work, he's working his way up, from really the bare minimum conceptual framework you need to understand value. And then eventually he'll get into credit, he'll get into international trade, in the second volume, he gets into a lot more complex issues, but that's why I find it so like.
Dumb question, but since you're the Proudhon expert, do you were the two volumes published simultaneously?
I believe they were.
Okay.
I don't know if I would say I'm an expert. I've
okay, as the
fallen
person
down a rabbit hole for sure, though.
Yeah, fair enough. As the person of the three of us who spent the most time down that rabbit hole, I was just wondering if you do that or not. Because I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know why they weren't translated to English at the same time. I think Rudolf Rocker, an anarchist, translated the first volume to English, and then just no one has bothered to do the second volume.
Okay. So just as a heads up, obviously, you guys can keep talking for as long as you two want after I go, but I am going to turn into a pumpkin in about 12-15 minutes. So if that
can we talk about Bakunin before you go, and then
if that impacted how you wanted to structure the next little bit of the discussion, just wanted to
let's leave Proudhon aside for now and talk about Bakunin, because I have something to say about him based on basically one step up from reading Wikipedia.
Okay.
Anne Robertson describes the difference that Marx had with Bakunin in a piece in a socialist journal. And she said, Bakunin believed that mankind was a moral creature by nature, whereas Marx believed that mankind's nature was essentially free and rational. Robertson describes this as a conflict between Enlightenment and empirical or empiricist understandings of the world on Bakunin's side and a Hegelian approach on the other. So I thought that might be a useful thing to say about Bakunin and anarchism.
Sorry. What was the Hegelian approach? Then what was the first one?
Marx, the first one was like the empiricist and Enlightenment view of the human person. So we are basically, it's similar to Proudhon in a way. It's like we're rational creatures always working on solving the kind of the same problems. We have this internal, we are reasoned creatures. We are Prometheus. We are we've discovered mankind's true nature. So I'll say that, and then I have another follow-up to that for you specifically, Ben. But go ahead, Ben.
That's interesting. So I'm gonna steer way clear of trying to comment on Bakunin because I haven't, I've read a teeny bit of Bakunin over the years, but I haven't even looked at his Wikipedia as recently as you have. So but I will say that the point about Hegel is interesting because I guess I don't. Yeah, it's sort of because the obvious follow-up question is what's the Hegelian view, right?
Well, I don't know what she thinks the Hegelian view is, but I would say the Hegelian view would be something along the lines of what we described earlier, only not in terms of modes of production, but maybe in terms of modes of life or of ideologies or something like that, the development of different conditions and the development of a condition of freedom through a process of historical unfolding, which does create change.
That might be right. So I know, the Hegel stuff is also certainly part of what Marx understands as being an issue between him and Proudhon Proudhon says all this stuff in the Philosophy of Poverty that is, he doesn't say the word Hegel, so it's open to interpretation, but it feels very Hegelian. He's certainly using a lot of the same words in the same ways that people who are trying to describe Hegel's dialectics use them. That much at least we could say for sure, thesis and antithesis, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I know from our discussion before, I know from our discussion before we recorded this that there's an alternate view according to which that, you know, he's really trying to do something else, but it certainly, you know, that was certainly my reading, you know, without Marx, you know, without filtering it through Marx's reading. I mean, that was what I thought when I was reading it. It's like, oh, it seems like he's trying, you know, it seems like he's using all this Hegelian language here. And Marx certainly takes it that way, but, you know, but he accuses him of like misunderstanding Hegel. You know, he defends the honor of Hegel just like he defends the honor of the bourgeois economists. And he says, no, this isn't what, you know, this isn't what Hegel is saying, because really it's this other thing, like, you know, kind of what you just said, right? That, you know, he has, I mean, I think the alternate reading is that Proudhon is really doing something that's supposed to be like Kant's antinomies of pure reason, although I don't know that I totally understand how that view works, because the whole point about the antinomies of pure reason is that they're unsolvable. And it does seem like Proudhon thinks that there are solutions to all of this. I mean,
which would make him a Hegelian, right?
I suppose so, right? Yeah, right. Because that's a way of reading like the progression from Kant to Hegel. That, you know, that right. Yeah. I think that might be right. You know, but this is, you know, so there are two questions here. One is an exegetical question, right? Which is Proudhon trying to be Hegelian and failing? And then there's like the sort of substantive philosophical question, which is, well, if he's not trying to be Hegelian, should he? Right? Like, right. You know, is the thing that's like, is the thing that, you know, Proudhon's getting wrong sort of the, you know, sort of down to the his point having a, you know, insufficiently Hegelian structure to it, which is certainly what Marx thinks, and you know, in a weird way, right? Despite you know, like, despite not, you know, not really being the kind of, you know, Marx guy who typically talks in a very Hegelian way, I kind of think he's right about that, you know, for the reasons that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Before you go, Ben, I want to ask you both a question, or put this into a different, the whole thing into a different context, make it a little bit less academic, maybe.
Sure.
To put it into this current contemporary political context, maybe around foreign policy and war. And I've noticed over the last couple of years, it seems to me that a lot of the arguments in politics, whether they're on the left or the right, are assuming that the difficulties and the wars and the conflicts are arising due to people who are just failing to be proper, moral, just characters, and that has come down to deciding: are you on Putin's side, or are you on Ukraine's side? Are you on Hamas's side, or are you on Israel's side? Rather than looking at the problems that are on both sides, the problem that is universal that we might want to change. In other words, changing the mode of production as a Marxist would change the kinds of problems we're facing. Changing the politics in the Middle East would change the kinds of problems that we're facing. Breaking from a Wilsonian nationalist model of world politics into an internationalist model would change the kinds of problems that we're facing. And it would not be a matter of like choosing one side or another. And so this has been what I've attempted to say. I have not been you know, some people like what I say, some people do not. But do you think that there are times where conceptions of what's just end up reinforcing this mode of production or this way of life as the only possible, as a universal transhistorical way of life that doesn't have the possibility for change, especially when we're judging a situation like, the war in Ukraine.
Oh, I definitely can say to that, but I know you're on time limit, so.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You go first, Ben.
Okay. Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with a part of that, right? So I guess I think that saying that like appeals to moral sentiment have no place in all this would be going too far. I think that Marx very frequently appeals to moral sentiment in his writings, right? That I mean, certainly anybody who's read the last section of Capital knows that. But like, oftentimes they're like kind of raw waves of moral disgust, rolling off the page, and that's definitely part of the intended effect. But the sense in which I agree with you is that I do think that there is a way that, and I'm trying to think of how to put this without sounding too one note or too much like, the old man yelling at this, sky, the cloud, right?
Embrace it. Embrace it. I am the old man yelling at the sky. I accept it. Go ahead.
But I do think that, like, I do kind of blame Twitter for some of this. Like, I think a lot of people are trained by, like, a lot of people whose primary engagement with politics is online and whose primary engagement, and sort of has to do with these, like, news cycles and these cycles of who's mad about who, about what, who's mad at who about what, tend to, the only way they can really process anything that goes on politically is by just kind of having an immediate emotional reaction to it, and then like sort of doing the thing that maximally matches, that reaction, or not actually doing anything, but, having the rhetorical position that, most clearly matches that. So, so if you're, so if you have like the whoever you're the most mad at, right? You should just sort of take the position that most clearly, captures your condemnation and vituperation of that, person or government or bloc or whatever, right? So, if you have, if you're like sort of properly disgusted by, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which, I actually think you should be, but, if you are, then you should support the sort of maximalist, like, the U.S. should be super involved in this position because that kind of captures that, most appropriately in your mind, right? You kind of can't have a perspective other than sort of what do I condemn the most strongly, and then how do I express that condemnation, or even, I don't want to exaggerate this point because I think its prevalence is really overstated. I actually get the sense that I don't know how either.
Well, let's do it the opposite. But Douglas Murray, who was condemning the attacks of October 7th, writing for the New York Post, walking through the kibbutzes where people were murdered, outlining the horror of it, and it was all horrible, right? It was.
Sure.
And then, like, what his ultimate aim is to say, therefore, no matter what Israel does, we cannot criticize Israel. We cannot condemn.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like, that you have either, you either do the Douglas Murray thing, which I've seen lots of, that, I mean, certainly on social media, you see this all the time, people saying like, here's the, here's this horrible thing, then therefore, right, no ceasefire, therefore, it's like, everything Israel's doing is okay. And then there's the opposite phenomenon, which again, I think its prevalence is really overstated, but it definitely exists, right? Which is sort of like, well, what I'm most mad about is the dispossession and oppression and state violence against the Palestinians, and the thing that sort of most fully captures this is like, I'm not just going to be against what Israel's doing. I'm going to like support Hamas, that they like something like that, right? I mean, I think that you end up in strange and stupid places if you're just processing everything through like, what am I most outraged about, and what position sort of, feels like it captures that outrage the best, right? This is the thing that I'm, like I've been saying a lot for the last couple of years, that I really, and certainly even in like domestic politics, there are a lot of people who will say that they have that, I think that there are a lot of people who again come to a lot of strange and stupid places because what they do, I mean, it's not even really just like tailing some element of existing politics. That's what people think it is, but I actually think that's slightly wrong. What it is like reverse tailing whoever you dislike the most, right? So if the people who piss you off the most are conservatives, you just say whatever the opposite is of of what you think they're saying, or whatever you think is going to sort of most fully express your opposition to them, which usually means just siding with whatever the liberals are saying today. And if the people who piss you off the most are like annoying PMC libs, then you end up saying, you end up taking all these positions to sort of spite them, and then you somehow convinced yourself to become some kind of strange communist quasi right winger, and
just gone completely right. I mean, that happens a lot too.
Or you just go frankly right, totally right. That happens all the time. Yeah, totally right. So I think that is, and I think that I think that's all pretty bad. I mean, like it's and in a weird way, like it almost feels more like a I don't know, just kind of and I realize when I tell people to log off, I'm like the guy with the rolled up 20 still in his nose with blood dripping from it, saying, we should all be doing less coke right now, right? Like right. I'm clearly too online, but they have but that said, I think we should all start doing less coke, right? Like I think that's objectively true, however hypocritical. That
right.
That it's that I think that I think logging off and spending more time reading books and less time being angry, and so you can kind of work forwards, right? From like, okay, here are here's the analysis of the material world around me that I find convincing, and sure, here also are the socialist normative values that I care about, and let's work forward from that, instead of just kind of like letting the waves of outrage wash over me and kind of take me where they may.
Yeah. Well, I think you're got to go, right, Ben? You're gonna.
Yeah. No, I should. I've got to go. I've got to go drive to Burbank and teach, and I need to pick up like a print order for like the review sheet for the final exam first. So, yeah, I should actually be going. Are you guys going to carry on in my absence?
A little bit. Yeah. I think at least on this topic, Cyber Dandy should have a go.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. Talk to you guys both soon.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Okay.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.